First of all, what I call the main messages, so if you turn to the first page, I'm not going to go through these one by one. I'm just going to whip through them and pick out one or two that I feel are important. So I'm not going to look at the dates, so fairly obvious. The processes and problems, and it's the second bullet point I want to start with first. Now, I have to say, I left teaching 5 years ago after 35 years in the classroom, and I was never faced with the problem of entering EMI marks. And therefore, one of my deputies in controlled assessment is a head of English down in South Wales, and she told me when she had to put the marks on the EMI system last year, it took her forever, and she was very bored, and she wasn't very thrilled about the whole process. Fair enough, I can well understand it. However, it is now how it's going to be forever. The board is moving towards a kind of paperless world, and this is how things will be done. So you haven't got those forms you had before, those OMR forms that you had to put the pencil mark on. So you have to do it on the EMI. Now, I'm only mentioning this because it worried moderators greatly last year that when they saw the folders, sometimes the marks on the EMI system were not the same as the mark on the folder. In other words, there'd been transcription errors. The second thing I wanted to point out to you about the EMI system is that where the column says teacher initials, you must put teacher initials in, not set groups, because the computer cannot distinguish between teacher initials and set groups. So if it sees all your sets listed there, then it will just choose samples from each set, which means you wind up with a sample of about 50 folders or something silly, But if you put teacher initials in, it'll just choose 3 folders from each teacher and then make up the number as appropriate. So do get that right. The further down the page, the 6th bullet point there, when the reading and literature work is submitted, you do need to put with it the notes that the students have used. Now, a word or two about these notes. Once the student has used the notes and the work is completed and it's handed in, the best thing to do is just to attach those notes to the actual work. Because if the moderator receives the work without notes, they're going to have to contact you and ask you for them, ask you where they are. So it's important. You need to staple, probably, is the best way of doing it. Just give me a second. I'll come back. Staple the notes to the actual work. Then there's no problem. But if the work is received by the moderator without notes, then they'll be wondering where they are and they'll have to contact you. Now, I'll come back to you in a second, but it's possible that you've decided as a department or as a teacher that your students will not use notes at all. So you can decide to do that. Take that line if you want to. But it's essential that you then tell the moderator that the students had no access to any kind of notes, just the plain text. Now then, the last point, the page 2, top of page 2, very quickly, I'm afraid we will still need to have up-to-date class lists. And it would be really helpful, for lots of reasons I won't go into here, but it would be really helpful if you could mark on the class list what the student's actually doing. Now, sometimes it might be difficult if you've got a mixture in a class, and so don't worry too much then, but just give us an idea. These students are doing English or English Lang, English Lit, or whatever, so we know what's going on. No, oral submissions are no longer allowed in any board, I think now, for the reading and the writing. So you cannot submit an orally assessed reading piece. Okay? We really don't want a situation where the moderator's going to have to phone up and say, "We've got no work here. Well, what are we going to do?" So I'm pretty sure you'll all know that, but I'll mention it nonetheless. Word processed work. Now remember, they can do the whole lot on a word processor, or the whole lot handwritten, or a mixture of the two. There's no limitation now. We don't have to have a handwritten piece as we've had in the past. If they use a word processor for English and English language reading and writing tasks, they have to have all the aids taken off it, the spell checks and so on, and the access to the internet, their own notes and so on, their school files and all the rest of it. Fine. In literature, the situation is slightly different, because in literature, English literature, they're allowed to have access to spell checks and grammar checks. It's in English literature that is allowed. In terms of the assignments, as Wayne said earlier on, the assignments for 2012 go into 2013. So what you're teaching year 11 at the moment is exactly what you'll be teaching year 10. Do you see what I mean? The year 10 follow the same tasks as year 11. But for your year 9 candidates, there will be new Shakespeare poetry linked task themes and new selections of poetry. And for the writing tasks for English and English language, there'll be new titles. Okay? Those are all sorted out, they're all done, they're all ready to go on the website in April next year, as Wayne said. In the writing tasks, I do want to point this out, it is actually a requirement of the spec that you as teachers flag up errors. Now I'll tell you why I mention this. As I say, I've seen a fair bit of writing from controlled assessment now, and from different centres. And I was looking at one piece about 2 weeks ago, where the teacher had given an SSPS mark of 6. And I looked at the work, and I went through it, and I marked it. I found 37 errors on the first page. There was not a mark on this work, apart from a mark at the end. I found 37 errors on the first page alone. And so, a SSPS mark of 6 really doesn't make much sense. See what I mean? If the errors are marked, and as I say, it is a requirement of the specification, if you look at the spec, you will, of course, get accurate SSPS marks. Now, I'm not making a criticism. Most centres do it already. In the past, in coursework, it's happened that work has been very, very carefully marked. But I do want to point out that it is actually a requirement. You don't have to... You don't have to mark the errors in the reading work, obviously the technical errors in the reading work, but you can if you want to, help the child, the student, but in the writing it is a requirement. I want to start with the poetry aspect of the Shakespeare Poetry linked task, which goes into the English literature folder, and it goes into the English folder. Students can't do English and English literature, as you're well aware. They can only do English lang and English lit, or English by itself. So it's transferable, if you like, between the two folders. And in looking at work that I've seen from centres on this already, it's perfectly clear that most centres, if not all, well, the ones I've seen, can handle the Shakespeare work, or students can handle the Shakespeare work fairly well, because basically they're doing what they've done in the past. They're looking at a relatively small area of the text in the Shakespeare piece. They're with hopefully then moving on and making some more general comments about the play as a whole. But it's perfectly obvious from the way what I've seen so far that the students are really having trouble with the poetry. And really these problems are not particularly new. They've been knocking around for a long time. And I really want to try and help you to help the students to avoid issues, avoid approaches, which are not going to be helpful to them. And so this list of things really is a pitfall list on the Shakespeare poetry. I've headed it up, approaches to avoid. Now I'm sorry if that sounds very negative, but I think this is a way to be more positive in a way, so that students don't waste their time writing about things which are going to get them very few, if any, marks. Okay? So let's have a look at these approaches. Now the first one is looking at 2 poems and integrating them. Now you're familiar with the legacy spec, obviously, because you've been teaching it, and you know perfectly well that in the legacy spec coursework there were 2 opportunities in English literature to compare poems. Fine, okay. And you'll know if you've read my reports and so on, you'll know that for many years now I've strongly recommended that students, when looking at 2 poems, comparing 2 poems, that they don't interlink the comparison, they don't integrate the comparison, looking at an aspect in each poem, one after the other, like that, down the page. Now, in the new spec, they don't have to compare poems at all in the controlled assessment. If you look at the assessment criteria, you'll find it says link, it's at one of the columns, the right-hand column, is about linking and comparing texts. Now, the comparison of poetry comes in, he's gone. John Harrington's paper, in Margaret Graham's paper, the lit paper, Unit 1, you're familiar with. Unit 1, Section B, is the comparison of poems. That's where comparison is tested in our spec. The linking aspect is tested in CA, in a controlled assessment. So they don't need to compare poems. Let's be absolutely clear about that. They may do it, there's nothing to stop them doing it, but they're not going to be marked down if they don't do it, because it's not a requirement. Please be clear about that. Linking is different from comparison. Right? Now, in work I've already seen, to go back to my point, some centres have kind of continued with the old legacy coursework structure of saying, right, we take 2 poems from this selected list on a secure website from the poetry collection, and we're going to compare them. No. Wrong way to do it. Not the way to do it at all. Because, in fact, they don't need to approach it. Now, if you take my advice with the poetry, you will approach it, or the students will approach it like this. Look at one poem in some detail in relation to the theme. In relation to the theme. The theme is very important. That's what it's all about here now. That's what QCA required us to do at the very beginning. Okay? So when the student has done the work on Shakespeare, they've done that part of the 3-part structure, then they look, I would suggest you look at one poem in some detail in relation to that theme. Then, they should, I'll come back to what I mean by should in a minute, but then they should then look at the second poem, but perhaps in not quite so much detail. And then if they want to, they might make mention to a third poem, to show they've read a range of poetry, because the poetry selection is a text. It's a text, just like Mice and Men is a text, or Mockingbird is a text, or whatever. Now, remember I said should. I'm well aware, when I was teaching, I always taught bottom sets, and when I'm perfectly aware that students I can remember quite clearly, come back to my memory, burnt into my memory, some of them, as you might well imagine, would not be capable of doing the second poem. The real world. We live in the real world. And so with less able students, if they only look at one poem, it's not the end of the world. But they cannot get high marks. To be getting kind of C+ and into B's and A's and A stars, they really need to be looking at more than one poem. Right? Now, on the other end side of the coin is that students who then go on and look at another 4 poems are not doing themselves any great service. I think 2 is ideal, 3 is good, nice, you know, even though the third one won't be dealt with in any great depth. But then to go on to 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8 is a bit daft, because they're not going to be writing anything about those very usefully. They might make reference to them, but 1 in detail, 2, a little bit less detail, but still thinking about that theme. Third one, well, okay, fair enough, that's good, well done. Any more than that, stop. I say they might make brief references to other poems, but I wouldn't take it any further. Otherwise, A, they'll run out of time, and B, they won't be doing anything very helpful with them or useful with them. All right? Now, going back to my main point, which is integration, I do want to stress that I strongly believe that if students try and integrate the work they do on poetry, they will actually lose so much of the beauty, the quality of those poems, that they'll just be regarding the poems as kind of coat hangers to hang bits on. And I think, I have to be frank with you, I'm an English teacher and you are too, I think that's demeaning to poetry and it's demeaning to the poets. Because I think the poem's a thing of value, as I'm sure you do too, and shouldn't be treated in a kind of mechanistic way. When I started seeing the CA about over a year ago now, it was quite clear that while these are generally good centres, it was quite clear that while the centre had actually done a bit of teaching before the students did the CA, descriptive writing, I was particularly thinking about, they thought, right, that's done, finished, bag it up, put it away. And when I saw some stuff, I remember the very first school I saw, I looked at it and I thought, God, this is dreadful. This is absolutely awful. What's going on here, you know? And they were clever children. And I'm not criticising the teachers or the children or anything. It's just that it didn't really work. And you may well by now have found that when you've done something like descriptive writing, looked at the outcomes, thought, God, this isn't good. What are we going to do? Can I give you a bit of advice? I think with this piece of writing in particular, they need a practice at it, perhaps even 2. And the route you should take, in my view, the route I would certainly take if I was still in a classroom, would be to say, right kids, we're going to do this, I'm going to teach you how to do descriptive writing, and we're going to do one. It won't be one of those listed there, in the 2013 list, that, you know, that one you just looked at. It won't be one of those, something totally different, take it off an old exam paper. Give them maybe a couple of timed attempts. Get them in, mark them, and mark them really thoroughly, and point out exactly where they're going wrong. Closest marking, really close marking, so the students can have. Now that's perfectly legitimate and perfectly legal. Nothing wrong with that at all. Then when they come to sit down to do one of those tasks there that are listed in a controlled assessment, then they will be much, much better prepared for it. Has anybody taken that approach? I think it's a very, very wise one. I think it's very sensible. They've got 2 hours for the 2 pieces of writing. It doesn't matter whether it's English or English language. English language is where you get your description, pardon me, and your narrative expressive. English is first and third person, remember. So we've got 2 hours for it. I'm finding now that most centres seem to be making the approach of having the approach of saying, right, well, description is going to give you, you're going to give you 40 minutes, 45 minutes for that, an hour and a quarter for narrative expressive. I think the centres where they're saying an hour for descriptive and an hour for narrative expressive are probably not being very fair to either part of in the balance there. Think about the examination. I mean, we say in the exam, description about a page long, narrative expressive 2 pages long. And I think that's the kind of way you want to think about it. I don't know if that's how you have thought about it, but that's the way I think you need to think about it. And I'd be inclined, I think, if I was still in the classroom, to say, right, kids, you've got 40 minutes or 45 max for this, 1 hour 15 for that, and I'd take that approach. That has always been the rule. If they mess up, they've got it, and they want to do it again, they've got to do a different task. Fair enough, it applies to everything. So, in fact, if they've done supermarket and they've messed up with that, then go for it. So that's barred to your kids. You can't do that one. Have a crack at this one instead. And it's quite a quick thing to do with them, actually, isn't it? Because it's only, in effect, a part of a lesson, isn't it? 40 minutes. Anyway, let me push on with. With what I was going to say. Right, now I worry a lot about this, because we're seeing things here that we don't particularly see in the descriptive writing in the examination. Problems have arisen simply because students have more time to think about it. Now the first 2 points here, the first 2 points I'm making here, the overblown writing and the inappropriate and inaccurate vocabulary, are ones that seem to me to be the most important. Other things here, like verbless sentences and so on, you're familiar with. But these first 2 points have become really quite a worry in the CA descriptive writing, because the students have time to think about what they're doing. And the first one, I'm afraid, well, both of them actually, are generally failings in the most intelligent children. Not the weakest, the most intelligent. Because they think, rightly, sensibly, that in this writing they've got to show off their vocab, they've got to show off their sentence structuring, they've got to show off their ability to use interesting words and so on. Now they have, but they can fall into the trap of actually writing stuff which is almost incomprehensible in their attempt to be clever. Now, I'm not criticising the students at all. I'm not criticising teachers, because I know when I was teaching descriptive writing, I'd say to the kids, look, throw in 1 or 2 adjectives and adverbs here and there. Use decent verbs, won't you? You know the kind of thing we'd all say to students about teaching descriptive writing. Let's look at that first example. The hectic, buzzing, and lively fairground was vibrantly and ecstatically alive with the rowdy, spirited screams of the overindulged, excited and screechy children. Every part of that's got 2 or 3 qualifiers on it. And after half a page of that, but there was a page and a half of it, after half a page, believe you me, you had literally indigestion. If it couldn't cope, it's like eating too many cream cakes, stuffing fudge into your mouth all day long. It just doesn't work. It isn't good writing. Look at the last 3 words I've written in that blog. Good writing, descriptive writing, I think needs to be natural, and I think it needs to be unforced. As soon as it becomes artificial, then it starts losing its power and its strength. Now, if you look at the A-star descriptive writing on the web, which is about, not on one of the tasks here, it's on the school canteen, and look at that, it's quite a long piece. You'll see in that there's nothing forced at all. If you walked into a school canteen, you could see all those things were happening there. Natural, real, realistic, and so on. It's enforced. This student, who I in many ways admire, is just trying too hard. And in trying too hard, they're really messing up their chances. Look at the next block of example, the next bit of italics. Vocabulary also worries me. Show off your best vocabulary. Of course I would say that to students. But it has to be appropriate. It has to be carefully used. The town-sized flock moving in unison, arrived at the vibrant lit-up sign that read Carnival. The stench, misuse really, of succulent food, think about that one, encased us within its grasp. My little brother, the child wrote bother instead of brother, but that's not a major problem. My little brother's eyes widened with excitement as I entered through the dazzling arch that led to an array of spectacular stalls, keep with it, which promoted a certain game. You see how this child is tripping themselves up all the time. My brother's excitement burst, breaking my parents' chain of safety. Now, I've maintained that every idea that student's got is a good one. They're all good ideas. There's nothing wrong with his ideas at all. And I love the picture of, the little child pulling on his mother's arm, trying to get away to go on the dodgems or whatever. It's a lovely picture. But don't you think the students actually wrecked it by trying to be too clever? Can you see what I mean? And I think that, by breaking my parents' chain of safety is a very odd way of saying my little brother was pulling on Dad's arm, It's unnatural. It's it's pretty well unrealistic, isn't it? But it's very false and very unnatural. Please try to encourage your students to be natural in the way they write. Not to be, I hate to say it, but not to be too clever. I'm all for ambition, don't get me wrong. I'm sure you understand that that's the position I'm taking. But it has to sound right. It has to sound natural. It has to sound real. Look at the next one, because we are really running short of time now. Realistic details. As I entered the supermarket, all I could see were 3 armed men holding up the cashier. You know you're wrong straight away. You know you're wrong straight away. No. Supermarkets are generally not held up by armed men. Well, I'm sure it does happen now and again, but it's pretty unlikely. Realism is important. Being realistic is important. I won't read through the rest of it. You can guess what's coming. No, it's got to be realistic. And of course, that was going to develop into a narrative anyway, as you're well aware, which is the next point on my list there. The narrative. I won't waste any time on this because you're well aware of it. The story structure. Now, it's not mandatory for them to write in the third person, but it'll probably help. If they write in the first person, as many weaker students will want to do, as you're well aware, then they have to be careful that they don't write the story. Writing in the second person, I think, is the most unhelpful. I mean, if they start writing, if you're in a supermarket, you would see, they've pretty well had it, haven't they? They haven't helped themselves a lot there. Looking very quickly further on here, look at generalisation. In CPDs for years now, Ted and Ken and myself doing and Barry doing the exam part of the operation, have said, don't let them be generalised. They must, our phrase is, zoom in. And the same is true with the CA. Look at the bottom of page 8, top of page 9. One student wrote, little children streamed out of the school gate rushing towards their parents. The teacher stood and watched the children leave the school ground, and so on. Now, those are generalisations, but they can be used as topic sentences for a decent paragraph. Look at the next example. The mothers were gathered around the school gates, chatting as they waited for the children to be released. Late today, aren't they? One mother commented as she took another puff of her cigarette before throwing it to the ground and crushing it under her bright pink high heel. Further down the line of waiting parents, a woman in running gear frowned at the scent of smoke as it hit her. She looked down at her daughter in her all-terrain buggy, rather unhappily chewing an oat cake. And you see how that gets brought to life. Taking the generalisation, done something with it. And it's natural and it's real. I didn't often have the privilege of picking up my children from primary school, but I can imagine that kind of scene happening in a line of mothers or fathers or whatever, picking their children up. You can see it, can't you? It's real. The census approach I won't make any comment on, but I will say that for weak students, maybe that is their salvation. Let's be frank about it. Weak students find these things difficult. If the census approach gives them a structure, fair enough. But they're not going to get high marks. That's, if they were given, they started every paragraph, all I can feel, all I can see, then they're not going to be getting C+. In fact, it would be rather surprising if they got E+. But I accept that with weak students, it gives them a structure, fair enough. Real world time, okay? The drop-in all-purpose section is the last thing I want to mention, and then we'll stop for coffee. Increasingly in the examination, and now I'm seeing it in controlled assessment, students seem to have learned a block about a character. And it's usually a man in a suit or a young woman in a miniskirt with high heels. And it's almost as if it's irrespective of what the actual thing is about, the descriptive writing is supposed to be about, it's dubbed in. In fact, I noticed one in one sentence where in fact, the school... No, sorry, it was in the exam, last summer, in the exam, in the children's classroom, the art room. And at the back of the art room, there was, surprise, surprise, a man in a suit, with a bowler hat, wearing a briefcase. I suppose he could have been an Ofsted inspector, couldn't he? But anyway, right, there we are. So advice to students, I've put a bit of advice there for them, which you can share with them if you want to. And after that, what I've done is to give, won't have time to look at these, but I've given you an example of descriptive writing C grade, and if you look at it, we haven't got time, but I've put a commentary after it. If you look at it, you'll see that some of the things I've been talking about are seen in this work. Now, it's not a bad bit of work at all. Fair dues. It's a C grade bit of work. Charles tried quite hard, but has made a few mistakes, a few SSPS errors, and kind of using the wrong word kind of mistake, and so on. But it's not a bad piece. And after that, I've also put in a C grade piece of poetry, Shakespeare, link task, a complete essay, with again a commentary. Hopefully that will help. We haven't, I'm afraid, had time to get to those, but hopefully they will be helpful for you.